My name is Anne, and I am 29 years old. On what was supposed to be my wedding day, I stood in a carpeted hallway of the Grand Bell Hotel in downtown Boise, Idaho, staring at a printed seating chart that made my stomach drop. My parents, Thomas and Sarah, were not listed at table 1. They were not at table 14. They did not have chairs at all. Someone had assigned them a bare high-top cocktail table, wedged between the swinging kitchen doors and a busboy station. They expected a 65-year-old man with bad knees to stand for a 4-hour reception while local politicians ate filet mignon. When I went to confront my fiancé, I stood outside the cracked door of the groomsmen's suite and heard his father say, "My parents looked so poor they would ruin the aesthetic of the room." Then I heard the man I loved agree with him. What I did next did not just end a wedding. I walked onto the band stage, grabbed the microphone, and made a single announcement that bankrupted his family in front of 250 elite guests. Before I tell you the exact words I said to destroy him, please take a second to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, but only if you believe nobody should ever be ashamed of where they come from. Drop your age, your city, and your local time in the comments. I read every single one, and I love knowing who is out there listening. Now let me take you back to that afternoon. I was wearing an ivory satin dress I paid for myself, holding the heavy train in one hand as I walked down the quiet corridor away from the bridal suite. My best friend Harper had just pulled me aside to whisper that she walked through the reception hall and could not find my parents' names on any of the tables. I thought it was a printing mistake. I thought Julian would fix it. I thought a lot of things that morning. The air conditioning hummed above me. I stopped 3 feet from the heavy oak door of the groomsmen's suite. It was cracked open, just enough for voices to drift into the hall. Richard Sterling, my future father-in-law, had a voice built for boardrooms. It carried. He was adjusting his tie and speaking to Julian. "It is just a matter of optics, Julian." Richard said it casually, like he was discussing the weather. "Half of our commercial investors are out there. The Hayes family is lovely, but look at them. The father wears a suit that is shiny from being ironed too many times. If they sit up front, they ruin the photos. Having them stand in the back is a simple compromise." I held my breath. I waited for Julian to defend the people who raised me. I waited for the man who promised to protect me to tell his father to put the chairs back. Julian sighed. "You are right, Dad. It is just for tonight. They are used to blending into the background anyway. Anne will get over it." The words hit me in the chest. My father, Thomas, worked as a public high school janitor for 35 years. My mother, Sarah, managed inventory at a local flower shop. They drove a beat-up Honda and paid for my college out of pocket, so I would never have a student loan. They handed me a check for $15,000 to help pay for this exact wedding, and the Sterling family treated them like a charity project that had overstayed its welcome. A normal bride might have pushed the door open and cried. A normal bride might have caused a scene right there in the hallway. I am a forensic underwriter. My job is to locate hidden anomalies in financial records. I do not cry when people lie to me. I collect data. I stepped back from the door. My hands were steady. Julian did not know what I found on his laptop 3 weeks ago while organizing our tax documents for a new mortgage. Richard did not know his luxury commercial real estate firm was a house of cards. They thought my last name was just a coincidence. They had no idea the janitor they just shoved next to the garbage held their entire financial future in his hands. I turned around and walked back toward the bridal suite. I was not going to fix the seating chart. I was going to let them assemble their wealthy investors, and then I was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. To understand the profound betrayal waiting for me in that hotel hallway, you have to understand the people Richard Sterling was mocking. As I walked back toward the bridal suite, the heavy silk of my dress dragging against the carpet, I thought about my father. Thomas Hayes spent 35 years working as a janitor for a public high school in the Boise School District. He woke up at 4 in the morning, 5 days a week. During the harsh Idaho winters when the snow piled high against the driveway, he would be out there with a shovel before the sun rose, just so my mother could back her car out safely. My father drove a 2004 Honda Accord with a heater that only worked on one side. He wore 2 winter coats on his drive to work so he could save every spare dollar for my future. His hands were thick and scarred from decades of fixing broken pipes, scrubbing gymnasium floors, and tightening boiler valves. They smelled faintly of industrial soap and lemon wax. When Richard Sterling stood in that suite and laughed at my father for wearing a suit that was shiny from being ironed too much, he was talking about a navy blue jacket my dad bought at a department store over a decade ago. My dad brushed the lapels of that suit every time he took it out of the closet. He wore it to my high school graduation. He wore it when I got my college diploma. He wore it with deep pride because he paid for it with honest labor. My mother, Sarah, was cut from the same cloth. She managed the backroom inventory at a local floral shop on the edge of town. She spent her days surrounded by beauty that belonged to other people, standing on a concrete floor, stripping thorns off roses until her fingertips bled. She rarely bought anything for herself. Instead, she would gather the broken stems and day-old blooms the shop was going to throw away and bring them back to our tiny 3-bedroom house in Meridian. She arranged them in cheap glass jars on our kitchen table, so we would always have something beautiful to look at during dinner. We never had luxury. We did not take vacations to Europe or spend our weekends at a country club. But my childhood was rich in ways the Sterling family could never comprehend. The door was always unlocked for neighbors. Dinner was always hot and served exactly at 6. My parents showed up to every single event I ever participated in. They sat in the bleachers for every debate tournament and every science fair. When it came time for me to further my education, they sat me down at that kitchen table and handed me a plain white envelope. Inside was a cashier check that covered my community college tuition in full. They emptied their savings so I would never have to start my adult life buried under the crushing weight of student debt. That sacrifice built my work ethic. I took their investment and turned it into a career. I worked my way up the corporate ladder to become a senior forensic underwriter at a major financial firm in downtown Boise. My job requires relentless attention to detail. I track missing assets, uncover hidden liabilities, and find the truth buried beneath layers of corporate deception. I learned that meticulous nature from watching my father sweep a floor until it shined like glass. I am fiercely proud of my calloused-handed parents. I never hid where I came from. Then I met Julian Sterling. Julian was a junior partner at his father's luxury commercial real estate firm. We met at a downtown charity gala my company sponsored. He wore tailored Italian wool and smelled of cedar and expensive gin. He was charming in a practiced, effortless way. He asked me about my career and actually listened when I explained the complexities of underwriting. He did not check his phone. He did not look around the room for someone more important to talk to. He focused his entire attention on me. At first, Julian seemed like an anomaly in his world. He drove a modest car despite his wealth. He took me to quiet local diners instead of flashy, reservations-only restaurants. When I told him about my parents, he smiled and said he admired hardworking people. I let myself believe he was different from the trust fund heirs I usually avoided. I let myself believe he valued character over capital. That is the insidious trap of entering a world that measures human worth in zip codes and designer labels. The gatekeepers convince you that their polite nods are genuine acceptance. The illusion began to crack during our first year together. It was subtle at first, small comments masked as helpful suggestions. A raised eyebrow when I mentioned my dad was fixing his own transmission instead of taking it to a mechanic. A gentle sigh when my mother brought a homemade casserole to a dinner party instead of a store-bought artisan appetizer. I ignored the signs because Julian always had a smooth excuse. He would kiss my forehead and whisper that his family was just old school and that we were building our own life. I compromised my instincts to keep the peace. I shrank parts of myself to fit into a mold shaped by his mother, Victoria. Victoria Sterling was a woman who treated every social interaction like a chess match. She never raised her voice, but her polite suggestions felt like commands. She judged the quality of a person by the brand of their shoes. As Julian and I grew closer, his parents treated my family like an exotic charity project. They would invite Thomas and Sarah to their sprawling estate nestled in the Boise foothills and proceed to talk down to them for 3 hours straight. My parents accepted the subtle disrespect with quiet grace. They smiled through the condescension because they loved me and wanted me to be happy. They absorbed the humiliation so I would not have to. I thought I was protecting them by keeping the peace. I thought if I just worked hard enough and proved I belonged, the Sterlings would eventually drop the pretense and treat us as equals. I was wrong. Walking down that hotel corridor with the echo of Julian agreeing to hide my parents by the kitchen doors, playing on a loop in my mind, I realized a terrifying truth. You cannot earn the respect of people who require your submission as the price of admission. Julian was not a good man trapped in a pretentious family. He was a coward who used my love as a shield while his father threw stones at the people who gave me life. I reached the heavy brass handle of the bridal suite. My pulse was steady. A strange calm washed over me, the kind of calm that only arrives when you have nothing left to lose. I pushed the door open. My mother was sitting on a velvet sofa, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, careful not to ruin her makeup. She looked up and offered me a nervous smile. Harper stood by the window, holding a leather folio that contained my unsigned marriage license, the license required for the ceremony to be legally binding. I looked at my mother in her simple dress. I thought about the $15,000 check she and my father handed me 3 months ago. They drained their retirement fund to pay for the floral arrangements, the photographer, and the very dress I was standing in. The Sterlings paid for the grand ballroom, but they structured the entire wedding to function as a corporate networking event for their real estate firm. They took my parents' money to decorate a room and then refused to give them a seat inside it. I walked over to the desk where Harper left her purse. I did not shed a single tear. I needed clear eyes for what I was about to do. I had a secret of my own. A secret hidden deep within a digital folder on Julian's laptop. A secret the Sterling family was entirely oblivious to. They believed they held all the power in this dynamic. They were about to discover that the quiet janitor they banished to the back of the room was the only man capable of saving them from total ruin. As I stood in the bridal suite looking at the leather folio holding my unsigned marriage license, my mind traced the breadcrumbs backward. I needed to understand how I allowed the disrespect to escalate to the point where my father was assigned a standing table next to a catering kitchen. The truth is, the erasure of Thomas and Sarah Hayes did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate campaign. When you enter a world that operates on inherited wealth and social leverage, the gatekeepers do not lock you out immediately. They let you step inside the foyer and then spend months subtly reminding you to wipe your shoes. The foundation of this toxic dynamic was poured 18 months prior, during the very first dinner our families shared. Julian arranged a private room at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Boise. My parents arrived 10 minutes early. My father wore his best collared shirt, and my mother spent an hour curling her hair. Richard and Victoria Sterling arrived 20 minutes late, offering breezy, unapologetic greetings before taking their seats. Richard immediately waved off the sommelier's standard recommendations and ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than my father earned in an entire week of sweeping gymnasium floors. When the waiter poured the dark liquid into the crystal glasses, Richard leaned back in his leather chair and swirled his drink. He fixed his gaze on my dad across the table. His expression softened into a look of deep, patronizing sympathy. "So Thomas," Richard said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "are you still cleaning up after teenagers over at the high school?" He did not deliver the question with overt malice. He delivered it with pity, and pity is an infinitely sharper weapon. It strips the dignity from honest labor and frames it as a tragic circumstance. My father did not flinch. He placed his hands on the table, thick knuckles and calloused palms resting against the pristine white linen. "I keep the building running, Richard," my dad answered, his tone steady and proud. "It is good, honest work. and it put my daughter through college. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I opened my mouth to defend my father, to list the sacrifices he made and the grueling hours he worked. Before I could speak a single syllable, Julian reached under the table and squeezed my knee. He leaned in close, brushing his lips against my ear. "He is just old school," Julian whispered. "Do not take the bait, Anne. Just ignore him." Like a fool, I swallowed my anger. I drank the expensive wine and let the conversation shift to Richard's latest commercial property acquisition. That whisper under the table was the trap of the golden child and the outsider. The insider convinces you that their family inherent disrespect is merely a quirk, a generational flaw you must gracefully endure to maintain the peace. They frame your righteous anger as an overreaction. Over time, you begin to police your own boundaries, compromising your dignity, one quiet dinner at a time, just to prove you belong in their exclusive club. The microaggressions compounded as the wedding planning began. Victoria Sterling operated with the surgical precision of a seasoned politician. Every interaction was a test of compliance. 2 months before the ceremony, my mother found a lovely pastel blue dress for the rehearsal dinner. It was modest, tasteful, and bought on sale at a local boutique. Sarah was thrilled to show it to her future in-laws. Victoria inspected the garment with a tight, strained smile. "Sarah, dear Victoria said, placing a manicured hand on my mother's arm, "the blue is quaint, but we have a very specific aesthetic for the country club rehearsal. We want you to feel comfortable among our guests. Let me arrange a fitting at my personal tailor so we can find you something a bit more flattering." The subtext was deafening. Victoria was telling my mother that she was unrefined, out of place, and visually inadequate for the Sterling family's social circle. My mother lowered her eyes and gently folded the pastel dress back into its shopping bag. She thanked Victoria for her generosity. Later that evening, I found my mom sitting in her kitchen staring out the window. When I asked her why she did not tell Victoria to back off, she offered a sad, resigned smile. "It is your wedding, Anne," she told me. "I will wear whatever makes them happy, if it means they treat you right." My parents absorbed the humiliation so I would not have to. They allowed themselves to be treated as exotic charity cases because they believed Julian loved me. I believed it too. I operated on the sunk cost fallacy, convincing myself that once the vows were spoken, the boundary would be drawn. I reasoned that Julian and I would build our own life away from his parents' toxic shadow. But a forensic underwriter makes a living identifying patterns of deceit. I spend my days tracking missing assets and finding the truth buried beneath layers of corporate posturing. I should have recognized that Julian's inability to defend my family was not a desire for peace. It was profound cowardice. The Sterlings treated the 250 guest list like a corporate networking event. They stacked the ballroom with local senators, wealthy investors, and commercial developers. My parents quietly handed me a cashier check for $15,000, which represented a vast portion of their life savings. They wanted to contribute. They wanted to feel like they were hosting their daughter wedding. That money paid for the towering white orchids, the professional photographer, and the ivory satin gown I wore. The Sterlings paid for the grand ballroom, but they never missed an opportunity to remind everyone who secured the venue. I let them run the show. I let Victoria dictate the menu. I let Richard invite his business partners. I watched my parents retreat to the margins of my own celebration, and I justified it by focusing on the finish line. I did not realize that Richard Sterling's towering arrogance was a fragile facade. Men who possess true power do not need to belittle high school janitors over a steak dinner. Men who are secure in their wealth do not micromanage a seating chart to hide their working-class in-laws. Richard needed to dominate Thomas because Richard was secretly drowning. His posturing was a desperate smokescreen designed to project strength he no longer possessed. I did not know this during that initial dinner, and I did not know it when Victoria insulted my mother dress. I only discovered the truth 3 weeks before the wedding morning. While organizing our combined tax documents to secure the mortgage on our new home, I borrowed Julian's laptop. He left it open on his desk. I was looking for his recent W-2 forms when I stumbled across a hidden financial directory. The files inside that folder painted a picture of a real estate empire teetering on the brink of total collapse. What I found in those documents should have made me call off the engagement immediately. It tied the arrogant Sterling family directly to the humble janitor they treated with such disdain. And it set the stage for the most devastating public execution Boise High society had ever witnessed. Wedding planning rarely feels like a merger. But from the moment Richard Sterling secured the Grand Bell Hotel ballroom, my upcoming marriage became a corporate acquisition. The Sterling family did not view the 250 guest list as a gathering of loved ones to witness a sacred vow. They treated the entire evening as a high-stakes networking event, orchestrated to project an illusion of unshakable wealth. Victoria Sterling commandeered the invitations with a gold-plated fountain pen, crossing out the names of my childhood friends and extended relatives to make room for local Boise politicians, real estate developers, and commercial investors. Out of 250 seats, only 30 were allocated to the people who actually cared about me. When I tried to push back against the unbalanced ratio, Julian offered his usual polished excuses. He would run a hand through his hair and explain that his father needed to maintain crucial industry relationships. Julian promised we would have a private, intimate dinner with my family after the honeymoon to make up for the crowded reception. Inside was a cashier check for $15,000. I stared at the numbers. I knew exactly what that amount meant to them. It was a massive fraction of their life savings, carefully hoarded over decades of sweeping floors and stripping thorns off roses. The Sterlings knew about the contribution. I made sure Julian told his parents that Thomas and Sarah were covering significant portions of the aesthetic costs. Richard and Victoria offered a tight, patronizing smile and a brief word of thanks. Yet they never missed a single opportunity to remind the vendors, the planners, and the guests that they were the ones funding the Grand Bell Ballroom. They treated my parents' $15,000 like a cute, insignificant gesture while claiming total ownership of the event. My parents accepted being sidelined with a grace that broke my heart. When the wedding planner accidentally left them off the initial floral consultation email, my mother just waved it off. "It is your day, Anne," she told me over the phone. "We do not need to be in the spotlight. We just want to see you happy." I allowed the Sterlings to run the show because I was operating on a dangerous psychological trap known as the sunk cost fallacy. I had already invested 2 years of my life into Julian. I had already compromised my boundaries, endured the subtle insults, and shrunk my footprint to fit inside his world. I rationalized his passive behavior by believing that marriage represented a magic threshold. I convinced myself that once we signed the legal documents, Julian would finally sever the umbilical cord to his family wealth and stand beside me as an independent man. I was willfully ignoring my own professional instincts. As a senior forensic underwriter, my entire career is built on the premise that people lie and numbers tell the truth. I spend 40 hours a week auditing corporate profiles, searching for hidden liabilities, offshore accounts, and masked debts. I am trained to look past the glossy marketing brochures and find the rotting wood in the foundation. I should have applied that same ruthless scrutiny to my own relationship long before the invitations were mailed. The universe has a strange way of forcing you to look at the things you are trying to ignore. 3 weeks before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle, the illusion of the Sterling Empire shattered in my living room. Julian and I were sitting on the couch in our downtown apartment. We were applying for a joint mortgage to purchase a house in the Boise foothills. The loan officer needed our most recent tax documents and proof of liquid assets. Julian was in the kitchen pouring us a glass of wine. His laptop was open on the coffee table. He called out and told me to just search his hard drive for a folder labeled tax returns and email the PDF files to the bank. I pulled the computer onto my lap. I opened the File Explorer and typed the search query. The system populated a list of documents. As I scrolled through the results, my eyes caught a peculiar file name buried in a subfolder. It was labeled Hayes Trust Renewal Strategy. Seeing my own maiden name attached to a Sterling Real Estate corporate file triggered an immediate alarm. It was not a common name in this context. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. I knew looking into a private business directory crossed a line, but the underwriter inside me took over. I double-clicked the folder. What I discovered in those directories should have made me pack my bags and call off the wedding that very night. The documents painted a horrifying financial reality. Sterling Real Estate was not a thriving empire. It was a hollow shell. Richard Sterling had over-leveraged every single property in his portfolio. The company was drowning in toxic debt, facing margin calls from 3 different regional banks. Their liquidity was practically non-existent. The internal emails between Richard and his chief financial officer were frantic, desperate, and stained with panic. I opened a spreadsheet detailing their flagship asset. It was a massive luxury commercial plaza in the heart of downtown Boise. It generated 70% of their operating revenue. The plaza was the only thing keeping the banks from foreclosing on their entire portfolio. But as I read the ground lease agreement attached to the asset, I stopped breathing. The Sterlings owned the physical building, but they did not own the dirt underneath it. They leased the land from a blind entity known as the Hayes Family Trust. The lease was set to expire in exactly 30 days. I opened the corresponding email chain. Richard was begging the trust representatives for a 10-year renewal. The trust lawyers had formally declined the extension, citing a desire to liquidate or develop the land independently. Without that ground lease, the Sterling Plaza was worthless. The banks would call in the loans, and Richard would face total bankruptcy within a month. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the glowing screen. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. The massive, extravagant wedding was not a celebration. It was a desperate public relations stunt. Richard stacked the guest list with his nervous investors and local politicians to project an aura of immense stability. He was using the Grand Bell Ballroom to convince the city that Sterling Real Estate was flush with cash. He was using my wedding to buy himself time. Julian walked back into the living room holding 2 glasses of wine. He smiled at me, looking like the perfect, wealthy groom. He had no idea I was looking at the autopsy report of his family legacy. I closed the laptop. I took the wine glass. I did not say a word. I did not confront him about the impending bankruptcy, because the name on that land trust kept echoing in my mind. Hayes Family Trust. I knew my father came from a quiet, modest background. I knew his late brother passed away 2 decades ago, leaving behind a convoluted estate that my dad never spoke about. I needed to make a phone call to Thomas Hayes. I needed to know exactly who my father really was before I blew up my relationship. I spent the next 3 weeks operating in a state of cold, calculated silence. I played the part of the happy bride. I went to the final dress fittings. I smiled at Victoria during the rehearsal dinner. I waited for Julian to offer a shred of honesty about his financial terror. He never did. He lied to my face every single day. That brings us back to the morning of the wedding, the morning I sat in the bridal suite while my mother buttoned my ivory gown, the morning my phone buzzed on the vanity mirror, lighting up with a text message from Julian. The message read, "Dad handled the final seating chart and everything is perfect. I cannot wait to see you walk down the aisle." 10 minutes later, Harper walked into the room with a pale face and told me my parents' names were missing from the tables. Julian did not just lie about his finances. He lied about protecting the people I loved. As I marched down the hallway to find him, the financial secrets on that laptop forged a weapon in my hands. The Sterlings thought they were hiding a janitor by the kitchen doors. They were about to learn a brutal lesson about the true cost of arrogance. The morning of the wedding started with a quiet, fragile beauty. I woke up in the sprawling bridal suite on the top floor of the Grand Bell Hotel. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the Boise skyline and casting long golden shadows across the pristine white carpets. For a fleeting hour, I allowed myself to pretend everything was normal. I pushed the terrifying financial secrets I had discovered on Julian's laptop to the deepest corners of my mind. I told myself I would confront him after the vows were spoken. I wanted to give him one last chance to be the man I thought I fell in love with. My mother, Sarah, arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. She carried a small canvas tote bag holding a pair of sensible nude heels she bought specifically for today. She did not want to risk tripping on the marble floors of the venue. She looked around the opulent suite with wide eyes, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wore a simple, tailored dress that she had steamed 3 times the night before. When it was time to put on my gown, my mother stepped behind me. Her hands were still rough from decades of working in the floral shop back room. I could feel the faint calluses on her fingertips as she carefully guided the delicate pearl buttons through the silk loops running down my spine. She was holding her breath, trying not to cry, because she did not want to ruin her makeup. We stood in front of the gilded mirror together, the daughter of a high school janitor standing in a dress that cost more than her parents' first car. My mother smoothed the veil over my shoulders and kissed my cheek. My phone buzzed on the vanity counter. The screen lit up, vibrating against the marble surface. I reached over and picked it up. It was a text message from Julian. The message read, "Dad handled the final seating chart this morning, and everything is perfect. I cannot wait to see you walk down the aisle." I read those words 3 times. The phrasing was deliberate. Julian was distancing himself from the logistics while simultaneously assuring me the outcome was flawless. He abdicated the responsibility to Richard, but claimed the result was perfect. It was the digital equivalent of washing his hands. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, a localized instinct born from years of auditing corporate disclosures. When a person over-explains a minor detail without being prompted, they are usually trying to cover their tracks. Before I could reply, the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite opened. My best friend and bridesmaid Harper stepped inside. Harper is a litigation paralegal at a prominent law firm in downtown Boise. We met during our freshman year of college and bonded over our shared obsession with precision. Harper reads fine print for a living. She spends her days searching for loopholes, drafting subpoenas, and managing chaotic discovery files. She does not panic under pressure. She relies on observable facts. Harper gently closed the door behind her. She did not smile. She did not offer the standard bridal party compliments about how beautiful I looked. She walked straight toward me, her posture rigid and her eyes fixed on mine. She glanced at my mother, who was busy organizing my jewelry box on the other side of the room. Harper stepped close, invading my personal space, and lowered her voice to a barely audible whisper. "Anne, we have a situation," she said. I kept my expression neutral. "What is wrong?" I asked. "I just walked through the reception hall downstairs," Harper whispered. "I wanted to check the white orchids because I know your mom paid for them. The floral arrangements look stunning, but I checked the tables. I looked at the place cards to see where we were sitting. Anne, I walked the entire room. Your parents' names are not on any of the tables." A cold, heavy drop hit the bottom of my stomach. The air in the bridal suite suddenly felt thin. I looked at the glowing screen of my phone, still resting in my hand. Julian's text message glared back at me. "Dad handled the final seating chart this morning, and everything is perfect." He knew. Julian knew his father erased my parents from the floor plan, and he sent me a text message lying about it to ensure I walked down the aisle without asking questions. The betrayal was so deep it bypassed my emotional receptors and struck bone. This was not a printing error. This was a calculated strike. I looked across the room at Sarah. She was humming a soft tune, carefully placing my pearl earrings into a velvet pouch. I thought about the $15,000 cashier check she and Thomas handed me at their Formica kitchen table. That money was the physical manifestation of 35 years of sweeping gymnasium floors and stripping thorns off discount roses. They drained their safety net to buy those white orchids. They funded the aesthetic foundation of this entire celebration. The Sterling family took their money, decorated a luxury ballroom to impress their commercial investors, and then refused to give the actual sponsors a chair to sit in. If you have ever had that gut feeling that the people you love are being mistreated behind your back, you know exactly how fast my heart was beating in that moment. It is a primal protective instinct. You feel the blood rush to your ears, and the world narrows down to a single, sharp focus. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice or throw my phone across the room. My forensic underwriter brain took the wheel. I had spent weeks wondering how to handle the devastating financial secrets I found on Julian's laptop. I had debated whether I should cancel the wedding privately or confront him behind closed doors. Standing in that bridal suite, with the realization that my working-class parents had been functionally banished from my own reception, the debate ended. Julian cowardice sealed his fate. Harper watched my face change. She saw the exact second the grief vanished and the cold calculation settled in. "What do you want me to do?" Harper asked, her voice steady, ready for instruction. "Stay here with my mom," I said. "Do not let her leave this room. Tell her I needed to check on the catering schedule." I turned away from the mirror. I gathered the heavy satin train of my gown, bunching the expensive fabric into my fists. I walked out of the bridal suite, leaving the quiet beauty of the morning behind me. I stepped into the carpeted corridor of the Grand Bell Hotel. The hallway was empty. The soft ambient music playing through the overhead speakers felt like a mockery. I marched toward the elevators. Every step I took cemented my resolve. I was not going to send Harper down to fix a simple seating mistake. I was not going to call the wedding planner and demand a revised chart. I needed to see the disrespect with my own two eyes. I needed to walk into that extravagant ballroom and witness exactly how Richard Sterling planned to treat the people who gave me life. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the cab descended, I prepared myself for the reality waiting on the other side. The Sterlings believed they held all the cards. They believed they could use my parents' money to fund their fake empire while hiding them in the shadows. They were about to discover what happens when you underestimate the daughter of a janitor who knows how to read the fine print. The elevator doors parted on the ground floor of the Grand Bell Hotel. I stepped out into the grand foyer, leaving the soft ambient music behind me. The heavy double doors leading to the main reception ballroom were propped open, allowing the catering staff to finalize the table settings before the guests arrived. I stood at the threshold, clutching the ivory satin train of my dress in my fists. I did not care if anyone saw me before the ceremony. The illusion of a perfect wedding was already shattered. I crossed the threshold and stepped onto the polished hardwood floor. The room was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in aggressive wealth designed to overwhelm the senses. 250 crystal chargers gleamed under the massive iron chandeliers. The towering white orchids my parents paid for commanded the center of every table, their delicate petals cascading down the silver vases. The 10-seat head table was positioned directly in front of the elevated dance floor, draped in imported silk linens. It was the visual centerpiece of the room. I dropped the fabric of my dress, letting it drag across the pristine floor. I walked straight up to table 1. The place cards were printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold embossed lettering. I picked up the first card, Richard Sterling. I set it down and picked up the second, Victoria Sterling. I moved down the line, Senator Davis, Mayor Hughes, Arthur Sterling, Charles Sterling, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, 2 major commercial real estate investors from Sun Valley. Not a single haze. I exhaled slowly, controlling the adrenaline spiking in my chest. I turned away from the head table and walked to table 2. The place cards listed Julian College fraternity brothers and their dates. I moved to table 5. It was populated by local Boise politicians and country club members Victoria lunched with on Tuesdays. I kept walking, pushing past the expensive floral centerpieces. Table 10, table 12, table 14. Nothing. My parents' names were completely erased from the floor plan. They were not seated with my extended family. They were not seated with the other vendors. They were simply gone. I reached the far back corner of the sprawling ballroom. The lighting was noticeably dimmer here, deliberately separated from the focal point of the room. I stood in front of the heavy swinging doors leading into the chaotic, noisy catering kitchen. The heat from the industrial ovens radiated through the wood. A busboy station sat 3 feet away, piled high with extra water pitchers and stacked service trays. Wedged between the kitchen doors and the busboy station was a single, tall cocktail table, the kind you lean against during a brief happy hour while waiting for the real dinner to start. It was draped in a plain, black linen cloth. There were no chairs. Resting on top of the bare linen, next to a single, cheap tea light candle, were 2 gold-embossed place cards. Thomas Hayes, Sarah Hayes. I stared at the cards. My vision tunneled, narrowing down to those 2 pieces of heavy cream cardstock. They expected a 65-year-old janitor with bad knees to stand for a 4-hour reception. They expected my mother, who worked on her feet stripping thorns off roses all week, to stand by a kitchen door while local politicians ate filet mignon 40 feet away. They took $15,000 from their bank account to buy the white orchids decorating the tables where the wealthy investors sat. Then they banished the people who funded the aesthetic to the darkest corner of the room. I did not cry. The emergency room level calm that dictates my professional life kicked in. I am a senior forensic underwriter. When I discover a massive discrepancy in a financial portfolio, I do not panic. I lock the door, pull the primary documents, and prepare for an audit. I treat human behavior the exact same way. I picked up the 2 place cards. The gold lettering felt rough under my thumb. I closed my hand, crushing the heavy cardstock into a jagged ball inside my fist. I turned around and walked back toward the main entrance of the ballroom. I passed the towering orchids and the crystal chargers. I did not look back. I was not going to locate the wedding planner and demand a revised seating chart. I was not going to fix the table, because fixing the table meant accepting the premise that the insult was merely a logistical error. It was not an error. It was a calculated strike designed to hide my working-class parents from the elite investors Richard Sterling needed to impress. I exited the ballroom and strode down the carpeted hallway leading to the private lounges. I knew exactly where Julian was getting ready. The groomsmen's suite was located at the far end of the corridor near the private cigar lounge. I did not bring Harper. I did not want an audience for what I was about to do. I needed to hear the truth straight from the source. I approached the heavy oak door of the suite. I stopped 3 feet away. The door was cracked open just enough for voices to drift into the silent hallway. I could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne and polished leather. I heard Richard Sterling's booming voice echoing off the wood paneling. It was a voice built for boardrooms and country clubs, a voice that expected immediate compliance. Julian Richard said, his tone casual and dismissive, like he was discussing a minor inconvenience on a golf course. It is purely about optics. Half of our commercial investors are sitting in that room tonight. The Hayes family is lovely, but they look so poor. The father suit is shiny from being ironed too many times. The mother dress is off the rack. If they sit up front at table 1, they will ruin the professional photos and disrupt the aesthetic of the evening. Having them stand in the back is a simple compromise. I held my breath. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, listening to the silence that followed. I waited for the man I loved to tear his father apart. I waited for Julian to raise his voice. I waited for him to demand respect for the people who raised me, the people who sacrificed everything to put me in this hotel. I waited for him to say, "That is my wife, family. Put their chairs back immediately." Julian let out a long, heavy sigh. "You are right, Dad," Julian said. His voice was calm, practiced, and profoundly cowardly. "It is just for tonight anyway. They are used to being in the background. Anne will get over it once the reception starts." The betrayal was absolute. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian did not just fail to defend my parents. He actively agreed that my family was visually inadequate and socially disposable. He used my love as a shield, while his father threw stones at the people who gave me life. This was not just snobbery. It was a fundamental agreement that my roots were a humiliating stain on his perfect corporate image. I stepped away from the wall. My hands stopped shaking. The jagged ball of cardstock dug into my palm. A normal bride might have pushed the door open and screamed. A normal bride might have thrown her engagement ring at his chest and run out of the hotel crying. But I remembered the financial documents I found on his laptop 3 weeks ago. I remembered the desperate emails, the margin calls, and the impending bankruptcy that Richard Sterling was desperately trying to hide. I remembered the name of the blind entity that held the ground lease to their flagship commercial plaza. A beautifully destructive plan began to form in my mind. I was not going to confront Julian in a private hallway. I was going to let the Sterling family assemble all their wealthiest investors, their political allies, and their country club friends in one magnificent room. And then I was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. The echo of Julian agreeing to hide my parents by the kitchen doors bounced around the empty hallway of the Grand Bell Hotel. I stepped back from the cracked oak door of the groomsmen's suite. My reflection caught in a gilded mirror hanging near the elevators. I looked at the woman staring back at me. I was wearing an ivory satin gown, paid for by 35 years of sweeping gymnasium floors and stripping thorns off roses. I was wearing diamond earrings, gifted by Victoria Sterling, to ensure I looked the part of a wealthy bride. I had spent 2 years shrinking my personality, editing my background, and auditing my own behavior to fit inside a family that viewed my existence as a temporary aesthetic flaw. I was not going to cry. I was not going to storm into the suite and demand an apology. Apologies from cowards are just rehearsed scripts designed to regain control of the narrative. Julian did not respect me, and Richard actively despised my origins. They operated under the assumption that they held all the leverage in this relationship. They believed their sprawling real estate firm, their country club memberships, and their bespoke Italian suits made them invincible. They were profoundly mistaken. I turned away from the mirror and walked back toward the bridal suite. My mind was moving with the cold, calculated precision of a forensic underwriter preparing for a hostile audit. I needed to revisit the financial autopsy I had performed on Julian's laptop 3 weeks prior. The documents I found hidden in that subfolder were not just a collection of bad investments. They were the blueprint of a collapsing dynasty. Sterling Real Estate was functionally bankrupt. Richard had over-leveraged every single commercial property in his portfolio to maintain the illusion of immense wealth. The company was bleeding cash, facing margin calls from 3 different regional banks in Idaho, and heavily reliant on one massive commercial plaza located in the heart of downtown Boise. That specific plaza generated 70% of their operating revenue. It was the only asset keeping the banks from calling in the massive toxic loans and foreclosing on the entire Sterling portfolio. But Richard Sterling did not own the dirt underneath his flagship building. He leased the land. The ground lease agreement was set to expire in exactly 30 days. The entity that owned the land was a blind trust called the Hayes Family Trust. When I first discovered that name on Julian's computer, I was sitting on my living room couch, paralyzed by the coincidence. Hayes is a common name, but in the context of Boise commercial real estate, it triggered a massive professional alarm. I had spent 3 weeks quietly investigating the connection without raising Julian's suspicions. I dug through public county records, cross-referenced tax identifiers, and made a very careful phone call to my father. Thomas Hayes is a man who values peace over prestige. He drives a beat-up Honda Accord and wears a decade-old navy blue suit because he genuinely does not care about material wealth. He finds joy in hot coffee, a clean house, and watching his daughter succeed. When I asked him about the trust, he sighed deeply, running his scarred hands through his graying hair. He explained that his late older brother William was a brilliant, eccentric land speculator in the 1980s. William bought up barren plots of dirt in downtown Boise long before the city expanded. When William passed away unexpectedly 20 years ago, he left the entire convoluted estate to his only living relative, my father. Thomas inherited a massive fortune tied up in commercial ground leases. He could have quit his job as a public high school janitor immediately. He could have bought a mansion in the foothills and joined the same country clubs Victoria Sterling frequented. Instead, my father chose to keep the wealth entirely secret. He locked the assets inside a blind trust managed by a team of quiet, specialized attorneys. He told me he wanted to raise me with a strong work ethic. He wanted me to understand the value of a dollar earned through honest labor. He wanted to shield our family from the toxic, corrupting influence of sudden, unearned wealth. He lived on his modest salary, paying for my college in cash, and quietly donating large portions of the trust income to local charities. Julian did not know. Richard did not know. Victoria did not know. The Sterling family thought Hayes was just a random surname attached to a faceless corporate entity. They spent the last 6 months sending frantic, desperate emails to the trust attorneys begging for a 10-year lease extension to save their company. The trust lawyers, acting on my father's strict instructions, had formally declined the renewal. Thomas did not like the way Sterling Real Estate managed their properties, and he wanted to develop the land independently. Richard Sterling was 30 days away from defaulting on millions of dollars. He organized this massive, extravagant wedding filled with his wealthy commercial investors to project an aura of total financial stability. He was using the Grand Bell Ballroom to buy himself time and convince the city his empire was thriving. And he just banished the sole trustee and owner of the land he built his fake empire on to a chairless cocktail table next to a garbage can. I reached the heavy brass handle of the bridal suite. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my gown. I pushed the door open. My mother, Sarah, was sitting on the velvet sofa. She looked up and smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Harper was standing by the window, holding the leather folio containing the legal documents for the ceremony. Harper took one look at my face, and the color drained from her cheeks. She knew me better than anyone. She saw the absolute lack of emotion in my eyes and instantly recognized the danger. "Did you fix the seating chart?" Harper asked, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "No," I replied softly, my tone even. "I am not going to fix it." I walked across the room and stopped in front of the window. I looked at the Boise skyline, stretching out beneath the morning sun. I thought about the 250 guests arriving in an hour. I thought about the politicians, the country club members, and the real estate developers taking their seats at the front of the room. I thought about Richard and Victoria beaming at table 1, projecting an image of absolute dominance. "Where is the marriage license?" I asked, turning back to face the room. Harper pointed to the leather folio resting on the mahogany desk. "We have not signed it yet. The officiant needs us to sign it right after the ceremony before the reception starts." I walked over to the desk. I placed my hand flat on top of the folio. A marriage ceremony is strictly symbolic until that specific piece of paper is signed, witnessed, and filed with the county clerk. Without those signatures, I was legally tying myself to absolutely nothing. "Keep it," I told Harper, looking her dead in the eye. "Do not let anyone sign this document. Put it in your purse and do not let it out of your sight." Harper nodded slowly, not asking any questions. She recognized the gravity of the instruction. Sarah stood up from the sofa, smoothing the skirt of her simple tailored dress. "Is everything all right, Anne?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "Are we ready to go down to the chapel?" I looked at my mother. I saw the calluses on her fingertips and the quiet, dignified grace she carried in her posture. I saw the woman who stripped thorns off day-old roses to make our tiny kitchen beautiful. I saw the wife of a man who owned half of downtown Boise, but still woke up at 4 a.m. to shovel snow from their driveway. "Everything is perfectly fine, Mom," I said, offering her a small, genuine smile. "We are going to have a very memorable reception." I turned back to the mirror, checking my reflection one last time. I was not going to cancel the wedding quietly. I was not going to run away and let Julian spin a narrative about a cold feet bride. I was going to walk down the aisle. I was going to say the vows. I was going to let the Sterling family assemble all their powerful friends in one room. And then I was going to execute a public financial demolition they would never forget. The truth about Thomas Hayes, the humble high school janitor holding the keys to Richard Sterling financial survival, is a masterpiece of quiet generational wealth. When you live in a city like Boise, where the foothills constantly sprout new subdivisions and the downtown skyline reaches higher every decade, land is the only true currency. My father inherited a sprawling portfolio of commercial ground leases from his late older brother William 20 years ago. William was a brilliant, reclusive speculator who purchased massive barren plots of dirt in the 1980s, long before the tech boom turned the Treasure Valley into a lucrative real estate market. William did not care about bespoke suits or country club memberships. He lived in a modest cabin outside of town, pouring every spare dollar into land acquisition. When his heart failed unexpectedly, he left the convoluted estate to his only living relative. Thomas did not view the inheritance as a lottery ticket. He viewed it as an enormous responsibility and a potential hazard to our family character. My father grew up working on a farm in rural Idaho before taking the custodial job at the school district. He believed that unearned wealth corrupts the soul if the foundation is not solid. He wanted to raise me with a strong work ethic. He wanted me to understand the value of a dollar earned through honest, grueling labor. So he locked the assets inside a blind entity called the Hayes Family Trust. He hired a specialized team of quiet, meticulous attorneys in downtown Boise to manage the commercial leases, collect the staggering monthly revenues, and quietly donate massive portions of the income to local charities, funding scholarships and community outreach programs. He never touched the principal. He continued to wake up at 4 a.m. to sweep gymnasium floors and fix broken pipes. He continued to drive his beat-up Honda Accord and wear his decade-old navy blue suit because material possessions genuinely did not matter to him. He found his joy in a hot cup of coffee, a clean house, and watching me graduate debt-free using the cashier check he saved from his actual salary. The Sterling family built their entire identity on the exact opposite philosophy. Richard over-leveraged his portfolio to project an illusion of immense, unshakable dominance. He borrowed against every building he owned to buy luxury cars, host extravagant galas, and secure a seat at Table 1. He constructed Sterling real estate as a house of cards, balancing precariously on massive, toxic loans from 3 different regional banks. His flagship asset, the massive commercial plaza generating 70% of his operating revenue, was the only thing keeping the creditors at bay. But Richard did not own the dirt underneath that plaza. He leased the land from the Hayes Family Trust. The lease was set to expire in exactly 30 days. For the past 6 months, Richard and his frantic chief financial officer sent desperate, pleading emails to the trust attorneys begging for a 10-year renewal. They knew that without the ground lease, the plaza was functionally worthless. The banks would call in the loans, and Richard would face total catastrophic bankruptcy within a month. The trust lawyers, acting on my father's strict instructions, formally declined the extension. Thomas did not like the aggressive, predatory business practices Sterling Real Estate employed across the city. He observed how they bullied small business tenants and manipulated zoning laws. He decided he wanted to develop the land independently or liquidate the asset to fund a new wing at the local pediatric hospital. Julian did not know his father was drowning in toxic debt until 3 weeks before the wedding. He did not know his family was 30 days away from losing their country club memberships and their luxury cars. And he certainly did not know that the quiet janitor he banished to the back of the Grand Bell Ballroom was the sole trustee and owner of the land he built his fake empire on. The Sterlings thought Hayes was just a random surname attached to a faceless corporate entity. They assumed the trust was managed by a consortium of faceless, out-of-state investors. They were humiliating the very man who held their entire financial future in his calloused hands. This brings us back to the bridal suite. I stood in front of the mirror looking at the woman wearing the ivory satin gown my parents paid for. I looked at Harper clutching the leather folio containing the unsigned marriage license. I looked at Sarah smoothing the skirt of her simple tailored dress, completely unaware of the public execution I was preparing to orchestrate. I was not going to pull my parents aside and explain the seating chart insult. I was not going to warn Thomas about Richard's impending bankruptcy. My father is a man of profound peace. If he knew Julian agreed to hide him by the kitchen doors, he would have quietly walked out of the hotel to avoid causing a scene. If he knew Richard was mocking his suit while actively begging his trust attorneys for a lifeline, he would have felt pity, not rage. I did not want pity. I wanted absolute, total accountability. I turned away from the mirror and walked toward the suite door. My forensic underwriter brain mapped the exact sequence of events required to dismantle the sterling facade. The first step was to play the role of the compliant, beautiful bride. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes in the hotel adjoining chapel. 250 guests were taking their seats, rustling programs, and admiring the towering white orchids. I stepped into the hallway, linking my arm with Sarah. Harper followed closely behind, the leather folio tucked securely under her arm. We walked toward the elevators, the heavy silk of my dress gliding over the carpet. I did not shed a single tear. I did not allow my hands to shake. I pushed the grief of Julian betrayal into a tight, compartmentalized box and focused entirely on the data. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor. The soft, ambient music of a string quartet echoed from the chapel entrance. The air smelled of expensive perfume, polished wood, and the massive floral arrangements my parents funded. I walked toward the vestibule where Thomas was waiting to walk me down the aisle. My father stood near the mahogany doors, his thick, scarred hands clasped in front of him. He wore his decade-old navy blue suit. The lapels were brushed meticulously clean. The fabric shone slightly under the warm lighting, exactly as Richard Sterling had mocked in the groomsmen's suite. But to me, that suit was the most beautiful garment in the entire hotel. It was a testament to 35 years of honest labor, deep integrity, and quiet sacrifice. Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He offered his arm, and I took it. His forearm felt solid and grounding beneath the fabric of his sleeve. He leaned down and kissed my forehead. "You look absolutely perfect, Anne," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I am so incredibly proud of you today." I squeezed his arm, feeling the steady rhythm of his pulse. I looked at the heavy chapel doors separating us from the 250 guests waiting inside. I looked at Julian, standing at the altar in his tailored Italian wool, looking like the flawless, wealthy groom, projecting a total illusion of stability. "Thank you, Dad," I replied, my voice calm and completely devoid of fear. "We are going to have a very memorable celebration." The heavy mahogany doors swung open. The string quartet shifted their tempo, signaling the beginning of the procession. The Sterlings believed they controlled the narrative of this entire event. They believed they could use my parents' money to fund their aesthetic while hiding them in the shadows of the reception hall. They were about to learn a brutal, devastating lesson about the true cost of arrogance and the quiet, immense power of the Hayes Family Trust. The heavy mahogany doors of the Grand Bell Chapel swung open, and the string quartet shifted effortlessly into a soaring bridal march. The collective attention of 250 guests pivoted toward the vestibule. I stood at the threshold with my hand resting securely in the crook of my father's arm. The air inside the vaulted room was thick with expensive perfume and the overwhelming scent of the towering white orchids my parents had funded. The stained glass windows cast long, prismatic shadows across the polished hardwood floor, illuminating the rows of wealthy commercial investors, local Boise politicians, and the country club members Victoria Sterling had painstakingly curated for this performance. Thomas Hayes took his first step forward, guiding me down the pristine aisle. He walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who had spent 35 years maintaining the structural integrity of public buildings. His navy blue suit, the one Richard Sterling had mocked earlier that morning, caught the ambient light exactly as predicted. It shone slightly at the elbows and the lapels, a physical testament to a decade of careful pressing and frugal preservation. I felt a surge of fierce, protective pride radiate through my chest. Every step we took was a silent rebuke to the arrogance waiting for us at the altar. Julian stood beneath the floral archway, waiting for me. He wore a bespoke Italian tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the casual, effortless confidence of inherited wealth. He offered me a warm, practiced smile that reached his eyes. To any outside observer, he looked like a man deeply in love, overwhelmed by the beauty of his bride. But the forensic underwriter inside me analyzed his micro-expressions. I saw the slight tension in his jaw and the quick, calculating glance he cast toward his father, sitting in the front row. Julian was not experiencing profound romance. He was managing a high-stakes public relations event. He was a coward who had actively agreed to hide his future in laws by a catering kitchen door to ensure the aesthetic of his family-failing real estate empire remained flawless. Richard and Victoria Sterling sat in the prime seating at table 1 of the chapel pews. Victoria wore a champagne silk dress that skirted the edge of bridal etiquette, her posture rigid and her hands clasped delicately in her lap. Richard sat beside her, projecting an aura of total dominance. He nodded approvingly as Julian and I approached, exuding the quiet satisfaction of a CEO finalizing a critical corporate acquisition. They were entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial demolition I was preparing to unleash upon their fragile house of cards. I reached the end of the aisle. My father turned to face me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He placed his thick, calloused hand over mine, squeezing gently. He kissed my cheek, transferring me to Julian care. He stepped back, blending seamlessly into the background, finding a seat in the second row while Richard and Victoria commanded the spotlight. Thomas accepted the marginalization with a quiet, dignified grace that broke my heart and simultaneously hardened my resolve. Julian took both of my hands in his. His palms were warm, his grip firm. He whispered that I looked absolutely stunning. I offered a small, tight smile that he interpreted as bridal nerves. The officiant, a polished, articulate man hired specifically for his commanding vocal presence, began the ceremony. He spoke eloquently about partnership, trust, and the sacred bond of mutual respect. The irony of those words echoing through the chapel while the grooming stood next to me, built a foundation of lies, was almost suffocating. I recited the traditional vows with mechanical precision. I promised to honor and cherish. I promised to stand by him in sickness and in health. The words felt hollow, stripped of their meaning by the devastating betrayal I had witnessed in the hallway. I slipped the gold band onto his finger, the metal cold against his skin. Julian slid my wedding ring into place, his thumb brushing the diamond Victoria had selected, because my original choice was deemed visually inadequate for their social circle. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife. The congregation erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Juliana leaned in and kissed me, sealing the performative transaction. We turned to face the cheering crowd, holding hands as we walked back up the aisle. We were officially married in the eyes of the attendees. We had completed the theatrical requirement of the afternoon, but I knew a critical legal technicality that the 250 cheering guests did not. The ceremony was strictly symbolic until the marriage license was physically signed, witnessed, and filed with the county clerk. Harper, my best friend and bridesmaid, possessed the leather folio containing that vital document. I had explicitly instructed her to keep it secured in her purse and to prevent anyone from signing it. Without those signatures on the dotted line, Julian Sterling and I were legally tying ourselves to absolutely nothing. We were just two people wearing very expensive clothing, participating in a highly choreographed play. The chapel emptied quickly as the guests transitioned toward the cocktail hour on the outdoor terrace. The string quartet packed up their instruments, the caterers circulated with trays of artisan appetizers, and the bartenders began pouring the signature drinks Victoria had named after her favorite European vacation destinations. The transition period allowed the hotel staff to finalize the sprawling main reception ballroom, where the seating chart insult awaited my parents. Julian and I were ushered into a private holding room near the kitchens to share a quiet moment before our grand entrance. He pulled me into a tight embrace, burying his face in my neck. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, the tension of the morning finally catching up to him. "We did it, Anne," he whispered, his voice thick with relief. "The ceremony was perfect. My parents are thrilled, and the investors are incredibly impressed." I stepped back from his embrace, smoothing the front of my gown. I looked at him, analyzing the specific words he chose to prioritize. He did not mention our future or his love for me. He mentioned his parents' approval and the satisfaction of his commercial investors. He had successfully executed the corporate networking event his father demanded. "Are you happy, Julian?" I asked, my tone deliberately neutral, carefully masking the icy rage pooling in my stomach. "I am ecstatic," he replied, pouring 2 glasses of champagne from a small table in the corner. "Tonight is going to be flawless. We just need to get through the reception toasts, and then we can finally relax." I took the crystal flute from his hand. I did not drink. I watched the bubbles rise to the surface, thinking about the high-top cocktail table draped in bare black linen, hidden in the darkest corner of the Grand Bell Ballroom. I thought about the gold-embossed place cards bearing the names Thomas and Sarah Hayes, wedged between the swinging kitchen doors and a busboy station. They expected a 65-year-old man with bad knees to stand for a 4-hour reception, while local politicians ate filet mignon 40 feet away. The point of no return had arrived. I was not going to cancel the wedding quietly. I was not going to pull Julian aside and demand an apology for the seating chart. I was going to let him walk into that extravagant ballroom and assemble his wealthy investors, his political allies, and his country club friends in one magnificent room. I was going to wait for the perfect moment, when the spotlight was blindingly bright and the attention was absolute. And then I was going to burn his fake empire to the ground. The cocktail hour concluded with a gentle chime echoing through the outdoor terrace. 250 attendees began migrating toward the main reception hall. I stood, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain near the kitchen service corridor. From this concealed vantage point, I possessed a full, unobstructed view of the sprawling Grand Bell Ballroom. Julian remained in the private holding suite, checking his reflection in a gilded mirror, entirely oblivious to my departure from his side. I needed a solitary moment to observe the trap his father had set. The guests filed through the towering double doors, finding their assigned places. The room swelled with the sound of expensive leather shoes against polished hardwood and the low hum of practiced networking conversations. The local politicians, real estate developers, and wealthy commercial investors gravitated effortlessly toward the front of the venue. Richard and Victoria Sterling held court at table 1. Victoria adjusted her champagne silk gown, beaming as a state senator leaned down to kiss her cheek. Richard shook hands with the ease of a monarch dispensing favors, his booming laugh rising above the ambient noise. They looked powerful. They projected an aura of invincible prosperity. I watched them exchange a knowing glance, reveling in the successful execution of their corporate masquerade. They had gathered the most influential figures in Boise, Idaho, under one roof to witness their faux dynasty. Then my gaze shifted to the back of the room. A young, frantic event planner holding a clipboard scurried through the maze of white orchids and crystal chargers. Trailing close behind her were my parents. Thomas and Sarah Hayes walked tentatively, navigating the crowded space with the cautious steps of people who felt deeply out of place. My father wore his pressed navy blue suit, and my mother clutched her small canvas evening bag. The planner did not guide them toward the center tables. She led them past the country club members, past the extended Sterling family, past the vibrant dance floor. She marched them straight into the dim, isolated corner near the catering kitchen doors. The planner stopped in front of the bare, high-top cocktail table draped in black linen. She gestured to the 2 gold-embossed place cards, resting beside a cheap tea-light candle. I watched my mother face fall. Sarah looked around, searching for chairs that did not exist. She touched my father's arm, pointing to the floor. Thomas looked at the busboy station, piled high with dirty water pitchers 3 feet away. He looked at the kitchen doors, swinging open to reveal sweating line cooks and stacks of unwashed prep pans. Then, Thomas looked toward the front of the ballroom, where the Sterling family sat enshrined in luxury. I saw the exact second my father understood the insult. The realization washed over his weathered features, not in a wave of anger, but in a ripple of profound, quiet resignation. He knew he was being hidden. He knew the wealthy in-laws viewed him as a shameful blemish on their perfect evening. Yet Thomas did not demand a manager. He did not cause a scene. He simply wrapped his thick, scarred arm around my mother's shoulders and pulled her close. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear, forcing a warm, reassuring smile onto his face. He was absorbing the indignity, swallowing the humiliation, to protect my celebration. He planned to stand on his bad knees for 4 hours next to a garbage bin so his daughter could have a flawless wedding. Seeing that selfless act of love weaponized against him ignited a cold, calculated fury deep inside my chest. The forensic underwriter took full control. I cataloged the data. Richard Sterling was actively degrading the sole trustee of the land his collapsing real estate firm relied upon to survive. He was mocking the man who held his financial lifeline. The sheer magnitude of that miscalculation was almost poetic. I let the heavy velvet curtain fall shut and walked back toward the holding room to meet Julian. It was time for the grand entrance. Julian was waiting near the main vestibule, pacing slightly. He smoothed the lapels of his bespoke Italian tuxedo and offered a bright, practiced grin as I approached. The master of ceremonies, a hired professional with a booming theatrical voice, tapped the microphone on the bandstand. The feedback whined briefly before settling into a crisp, clear tone. The live band transitioned from soft jazz to an upbeat, energetic anthem designed to bring the crowd to their feet. The energy in the ballroom spiked. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, his voice projecting through the towering speakers, "please take your seats and direct your attention to the main doors. It is my greatest honor to introduce to you, for the very first time, the new Mr. and Mrs. Sterling." The congregation erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. Glasses clinked, people cheered. Julian extended his right hand toward me, his palm open, ready to lead his bride into the spotlight. He expected me to take it. He expected me to smile, wave, and play the role of the grateful newlywed entering high society. I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at his handsome, flawless face. I did not take his hand. I pulled my arm back, folding my hands together in front of my waist. Julian blinked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He reached for me again, leaning closer. "Anne," he whispered over the blaring music, "what are you doing? They are waiting for us." I ignored him. I stepped past his reaching fingers, abandoning him in the vestibule. I walked through the double doors, alone. The heavy ivory satin train of my gown swept across the hardwood floor, dragging with a soft, rhythmic hiss. The cheering from the 250 guests began to falter. The applause became disjointed, uneven, as people realized the groom was not beside me. I did not smile. I did not wave. I kept my posture rigid, my chin elevated, my eyes locked dead ahead. I moved past table 12, where Julian fraternity brothers exchanged bewildered glances. I walked past table 5, where local Boise politicians lowered their champagne flutes, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. I marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, bisecting the crowd. Whispers rippled outward from my path like a stone dropped into a still pond. Julian scrambled to follow, trailing several paces behind, trying to maintain a relaxed facade while panic leaked into his eyes. I approached the dance floor. Richard and Victoria Sterling stood at table 1, their initial victorious grins melting into masks of tight, uncomfortable confusion. Victoria gripped her silk skirt, her knuckles turning white. Richard furrowed his brow, shooting a warning glare at Julian, urging his son to gain control of his errant bride. I did not stop at the head table. I bypassed their prime seating entirely. I walked straight up the short flight of stairs leading to the bandstand. The master of ceremonies stood near the center, holding his wireless microphone, bearing a frozen, uncertain smile. I approached him, extending my hand. He hesitated, gripping the device tightly. I gave him a look so devoid of warmth, so heavily laden with authority, that he instinctively relinquished it. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal casing. I turned to face the band leader, standing behind a drum kit. I raised my free hand and delivered a sharp, horizontal cutting motion across my throat. The band leader stopped playing instantly. The sudden absence of music created a vacuum. The remaining applause died out rapidly. The 250 attendees stood in a state of suspended animation. The clinking glasses ceased. The whispered conversations evaporated. The Grand Bell Ballroom descended into a heavy, profound silence. I stood on the elevated stage looking out over a sea of elite Boise society, preparing to shatter the pristine illusion they had all gathered to celebrate. I stood on the elevated bandstand, looking down at a sea of upturned faces. The wireless microphone felt cold and heavy against my palm. The Grand Bell Ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning circulating above the crystal chandeliers. 250 members of Boise High Society sat frozen in their gilded chairs, waiting for the traditional bridal address. They expected a tearful speech about love destiny and the blending of two prominent families. They expected me to play the role of the grateful newlywed, acknowledging her profound luck in joining this sterling dynasty. Julian stood at the base of the stage stairs. His bespoke Italian tuxedo suddenly looked less like a symbol of power and more like a costume. He stared up at me, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes silently pleading with me to relinquish the microphone and return to the script. At table 1, Richard and Victoria Sterling sat rigidly upright. Victoria maintained her polished smile, but the corners of her mouth trembled slightly. Richard narrowed his eyes, projecting a silent warning designed to intimidate. He was a man accustomed to blind obedience. He had spent his entire life bullying subordinates and manipulating partners to maintain his status. He had never faced a forensic underwriter holding a microphone. "Thank you all for being here this evening," my voice echoed through the towering speakers. The sound was steady, measured, and devoid of any tremor. 12 years of presenting complex financial audits to hostile corporate boards had trained me to speak clearly when the stakes were highest. I did not rush my words. I let the opening sentence settle over the room, giving the attendees a false sense of security. Several guests smiled, relaxing back into their seats, assuming the awkward silence was merely a bout of bridal stage fright. "Before we begin the dinner service," I continued, keeping my tone strictly conversational, "I want to draw your attention away from the head table. I need everyone to turn around and look at the far back corner of the room, right next to the catering kitchen doors." A collective rustle of expensive fabric filled the venue. 250 guests twisted in their seats, craning their necks to follow my instruction. The local politicians, the commercial real estate developers, and the wealthy investors peered past the towering floral centerpieces. They looked past the dance floor and the lavish bar setups. Their eyes landed on the dim, isolated space wedged between the swinging kitchen entrance and the stacked busboy station. They saw Thomas and Sarah Hayes. My parents stood alone beside the bare, high-top cocktail table draped in cheap black linen. They had no chairs. They had no crystal chargers. My father wore his pressed navy blue suit, resting his thick, calloused hand on my mother's shoulder. Sarah clutched her small canvas evening bag, her face flushed with sudden, overwhelming attention. They looked like two humble, hardworking people who had accidentally wandered into a billionaire private gala. "Those are my parents," I said, allowing my voice to drop an octave, carrying a sharp, undeniable authority. "Thomas and Sarah." The ballroom remained dead silent. The guests stared at the elderly couple standing by the trash bins, trying to process the visual discrepancy. In their elite social circles, the parents of the bride traditionally occupied the seats of highest honor. "My mother and father are not wealthy people," I stated, projecting the facts with clinical precision. Thomas spent 35 years working as a public high school janitor in this city. He woke up at 4 a.m. to sweep gymnasium floors and fix broken pipes. Sarah managed inventory in a floral shop back room, stripping thorns off roses until her hands bled. They live in a modest 3-bedroom house in Meridian, and they drive a car that is nearly 2 decades old. I paused, letting the reality of my working-class background wash over the crowd. A few country club members exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances. Victoria Sterling closed her eyes, taking a sharp, shallow breath. But despite their modest income, my parents handed me a cashier check for $15,000 3 months ago. I continued, gesturing toward the lavish tables scattered across the hardwood floor. They drained a massive portion of their life savings to contribute to this celebration. That money paid for the towering white orchids you are currently admiring. It paid for the professional photographer walking around taking your pictures. It paid for the ivory satin dress I am wearing right now. They funded the aesthetic foundation of this entire evening. The attendees looked down at the delicate, cascading petals sitting in the center of their tables. The physical evidence of my parents' sacrifice was sitting right in front of them. Yet today, my father-in-law, Richard Sterling, decided to erase their names from the seating chart. I said the words, cutting through the air like a blade. He took their money, and then he removed their chairs. A collective gasp rippled through the Grand Bell ballroom. The sound was visceral and involuntary. In the upper echelons of high society, cruelty is often tolerated, but it must always remain hidden behind closed doors. Exposing a deliberate, malicious social slight in public shattered the unspoken rules of their world. At table 1, Richard Sterling, face flushed a deep mottled purple. The veneer of the benevolent patriarch dissolved instantly. He slammed his palms flat against the imported silk tablecloth, causing his silverware to rattle. He half stood from his chair, opening his mouth to bark an order to silence me. He did not have a microphone. He possessed no leverage to stop the incoming tide. I did not let him speak. I kept my eyes locked on his, forcing him to hear the exact words he spoke in the hallway. Richard told my fiancé that my parents looked so poor they would ruin the professional photos I projected, projecting the quote with devastating clarity. He stated that my father's suit was too shiny. He declared that having them sit up front would disrupt the aesthetic of his networking event, and that they needed to stand hidden in the back as a simple compromise. The guests at table 1 recoiled visibly. Senator Davis, a man whose political career relied heavily on a populist working-class image, pushed his chair back, creating physical distance between himself and Richard. The 2 major commercial investors from Sun Valley stopped looking at my father and started staring at Richard like he was an infectious disease. The optics shifted instantly. Richard thought Thomas was the visual liability, but my announcement had just transformed Richard into a social pariah. I lowered my gaze to the man standing at the base of the stairs. Julian was frozen in horror. The charming, effortless facade had melted away, leaving behind a pale, terrified coward. And Julian agreed with him, I said, my voice lacking any trace of sorrow. My husband told his father that Thomas and Sarah are used to being in the background. He agreed to hide the people who gave me life so he could protect his family, pristine corporate image. Julian shook his head, frantically stepping onto the first stair. "Anne, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Stop doing this." I did not stop. I was a forensic underwriter delivering the final audit, and the numbers did not lie. I had dismantled their social standing, exposing their breathtaking arrogance to the exact audience they desperately needed to impress. The room was shifting, turning against the Sterling family, as the elite attendees recognized the sheer vulgarity of the insult. But exposing a social slight was merely the prologue. The wealthy investors at Table 1 were shifting uncomfortably because they detested bad manners. They were about to panic because I held the key to a much deeper, more catastrophic secret. Richard Sterling judged a man by the brand of his tailored suit while ignoring the fine print of his own survival. I tightened my grip on the microphone, preparing to pivot from a moral execution to a total financial demolition that would leave the Sterling empire in ashes. The tension in the Grand Bell Ballroom was palpable, stretching taut across the 250 attendees like a wire waiting to snap. The elite members of Boise society shifted uncomfortably in their seats, digesting the sheer vulgarity of the insult. Richard Sterling stood half-risen from his chair at Table 1, his face mottled and flushed a deep, aggressive purple. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her manicured hands flat against the silk tablecloth, desperate to maintain a facade of composure that had already crumbled. Julian remained frozen on the bottom stair of the bandstand, his bespoke Italian tuxedo offering no protection against the catastrophic public humiliation raining down upon his family. I held the wireless microphone steadily, maintaining eye contact with the wealthiest commercial developers in the room. They were the key to the second phase of my audit. These individuals did not care about hurt feelings or breached etiquette as much as they cared about their own portfolios. They attended this extravagant celebration, assuming they were aligning themselves with an unshakable financial empire. "But there is a very funny thing about optics, Richard," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence. I paced slowly across the elevated stage, my ivory satin train dragging behind me. I wanted every person in that room to focus entirely on my words. The acoustic reverberation of the microphone amplified the icy clinical authority I wielded daily as a senior forensic underwriter. "You judge a man by his department store suit," I continued, staring directly into Richard's furious eyes. "You hide an elderly janitor behind a catering kitchen door because you believe his calloused hands offend your delicate sensibilities. But you are a real estate developer, Richard. You should know better than anyone that a beautiful building is worthless if the foundation is rotting. You should spend less time micromanaging a seating chart and more time checking the signatures on your commercial ground leases." The ballroom remained dead silent. The phrase ground leases acted like an electric shock to the commercial investors sitting at Table 1. Two men from Sun Valley immediately straightened their posture, their expressions shifting from passive embarrassment to acute professional alarm. They recognized the terminology. They understood the sudden pivot from a personal grievance to a corporate vulnerability. "Sterling Real Estate is not a thriving dynasty," I stated, projecting the facts with devastating clarity. "It is functionally bankrupt." A sharp collective intake of breath echoed through the room. The local politicians, the country club members, and the fraternity brothers stared at the head table in total shock. In the world of high-stakes commercial development, the word bankrupt is radioactive. It destroys partnerships, dissolves credit lines, and triggers immediate panic. Richard's jaw dropped. His hands began to shake visibly. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The polished, arrogant CEO vanished, replaced by a desperate, terrified man watching his carefully constructed illusion shatter in real time. "You are 30 days away from defaulting on your flagship downtown plaza," I continued, the numbers scrolling effortlessly through my mind. "You have over-leveraged every single property in your portfolio. You are currently facing massive, toxic margin calls from 3 different regional banks. This entire 250-guest celebration was not a wedding. It was a desperate public relations stunt designed to convince these investors that your company is flush with cash. The two Sun Valley developers threw their linen napkins onto the table. One of them immediately pulled a smartphone from his jacket pocket, his thumbs moving frantically across the screen. Senator Davis stood up, entirely abandoning his prime seating, distancing himself from the toxic fallout. The optics shifted instantly. Richard was no longer a powerful patriarch. He was a sinking ship, and the rats were preparing to flee. "But the margin calls are not your biggest problem, Richard," I said, lowering my voice, forcing the crowd to lean in to hear the final, devastating blow. "You own the physical structure of that downtown plaza, but you do not own the dirt underneath it. You lease the land." I paused, letting the reality of a massive expiring ground lease sink into the minds of the investors. "And that lease expires in exactly 30 days, I confirmed. "You have spent the last 6 months sending frantic, desperate emails, begging the landowner for a 10-year renewal to save your collapsing company. The landowner, acting through a blind entity, formally declined your request last week. Without that extension, your plaza is worthless. The banks will call in the loans, and you will face total, catastrophic liquidation within a month." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of his most crucial partners contort into expressions of furious betrayal. He had lied to all of them, using my wedding as a smokescreen to secure their continued investment. I turned my attention to the dim, isolated corner of the Grand Bell Ballroom. The spotlight operator, hired by Victoria to illuminate the cake-cutting ceremony, instinctively followed my gaze. A brilliant beam of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the bare, high-top cocktail table wedged between the swinging kitchen doors and the busboy station. Thomas and Sarah Hayes stood in the center of the blinding circle of light. My father blinked, adjusting his eyes to the sudden glare. He stood tall, his navy blue suit catching the brilliance, his arms still wrapped protectively around my mother's shoulders. "The name of that blind entity is the Hayes Family Trust," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. Julian's head snapped up. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He looked at the janitor standing in the back of the room, and the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind. "Richard, Victoria, Julian," I said, pointing directly at my father. "Meet Thomas Hayes. He is the sole trustee, the primary beneficiary, and the absolute owner of the land you built your fake empire upon." The silence in the ballroom fractured, shattering into a million jagged pieces. The sheer poetic justice of the revelation struck the audience like a physical blow. "He inherited that land 20 years ago from his late brother William," I explained, filling the gaps for the bewildered crowd. "He chose to keep the wealth entirely secret. He chose to continue waking up at 4 in the morning to sweep floors because he values honest labor over unearned luxury. He let you humiliate him today because he is a man of profound peace who wanted to see his daughter smile." I looked back at Richard Sterling, who was now visibly hyperventilating, struggling to draw breath. "You just put your landlord next to the garbage, Richard," I said, delivering the final lethal verdict. The entire hierarchy of Boise high society inverted in a single sentence. The arrogant, wealthy CEO was exposed as a desperate fraud. The humble, discarded janitor was revealed as the hidden kingmaker. The guests at Table 1 began shouting over each other, demanding answers from Richard. The illusion was completely, irreparably destroyed. Julian scrambled up the stairs of the bandstand, his hands reaching out to grab the microphone, desperately attempting to salvage the unsalvageable. I stepped back, preparing to deliver the final technicality that would free me from the Sterling family forever. The absolute chaos that erupted inside the Grand Bell Ballroom was a masterpiece of spontaneous social destruction. I stood on the bandstand, holding the wireless microphone, watching 250 guests process the sheer magnitude of the financial execution they had just witnessed. In high society, Relationships are purely transactional. When a patriarch like Richard Sterling is exposed as a fraudulent liability, the loyalty of his peers vanishes instantaneously. The air in the room grew thick with urgent, panicked murmurs. The clinking of crystal glasses was replaced by the frantic tapping of smartphone screens as local Boise politicians and commercial real estate developers desperately tried to distance themselves from the impending bankruptcy. Senator Davis did not simply walk away from Table 1. He practically sprinted toward the main exit, his political instincts demanding immediate separation from a toxic donor. Two major investors from Sun Valley, the men Richard had spent 6 months courting, threw their expensive linen napkins onto their plates. They stood up simultaneously, glaring down at the hyperventilating CEO. One of the developers leaned over the table, jabbing a finger aggressively toward Richard's chest, his voice a low, furious growl that carried across the nearest tables. The illusion of the unshakable Sterling empire was dead. It was replaced by a frantic, scrambling exodus. Julian Sterling scrambled up the short flight of stairs to the elevated stage. His bespoke Italian tuxedo was suddenly wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair falling across his forehead. The charming, effortless facade was completely gone. He was a desperate, terrified coward, trying to stop a runaway train with his bare hands. He reached out his fingers, grasping wildly for the cold metal casing of the microphone. "Anne, please stop doing this," he begged, his voice cracking loud enough for the first few rows of guests to hear. "You are emotional. We can fix this. We can sit down with my dad and sort out the lease. Just put the microphone down and let us talk in private." I stepped back out of his reach. The forensic underwriter inside me analyzed his plea. Julian did not apologize for hiding my parents next to the catering kitchen doors. He did not express remorse for mocking his father-in-law's shiny suit in the hallway. He only cared about the expiring ground lease. He only cared about saving his collapsing inheritance. He was treating the humiliation of my family as a minor negotiation tactic. "We are not fixing anything, Julian," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the towering speakers, overriding the rising panic in the ballroom. "The numbers do not lie, and neither does the seating chart. You made your choice when you agreed to treat the people who gave me life like visual garbage." Julian shook his head, his eyes wide and frantic. He took another step forward, lowering his voice to a desperate hiss. "Anne, you are my wife. You cannot do this to your own family." I looked at the man I had almost tied my entire future to. I thought about the 2 years I spent shrinking my personality, editing my background, and absorbing the subtle condescension of his mother, Victoria. I thought about the $15,000 my parents drained from their savings to buy the white orchids currently sitting on the tables of investors who were fleeing the room. The trap of the sunk cost fallacy finally snapped shut, severing the emotional bond completely. "I am not your wife, Julian," I stated, my tone ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. The guests closest to the stage stopped moving, freezing in place as the legal technicality hung in the air. Julian blinked, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. The words did not compute in his panicked brain. We had just stood in the adjoining chapel, exchanging vows and rings in front of the entire congregation. The ceremony in the chapel was strictly symbolic, I explained, projecting the facts to the silent crowd. The marriage license required to make the union legally binding has not been signed. Julian's face went completely slack. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him a pale, terrified ghost. He looked toward the bridal suite corridor, realizing the timeline of events. He knew the officiant had instructed us to sign the legal documents immediately after the reception entrance. I instructed my bridesmaid to secure the leather folio before the ceremony. I continued exposing the final layer of my strategy. Neither of us signed the dotted line. There is no marriage certificate. There are no legal ties. I am a forensic underwriter. Julian, I do not sign binding contracts with fraudulent partners. Julian stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the top stair. He caught himself on the wooden railing, staring at me with a mixture of horror and sudden, devastating comprehension. He had lost everything. He lost his bride, He lost his dignity, and he had just lost the only piece of leverage that could have saved his family real estate empire. I reached up to the back of my neck. My fingers found the intricate clasp of the heavy diamond necklace Victoria Sterling had given me during the rehearsal dinner. She had insisted I wear the jewelry, explicitly stating my own modest pearls were visually inadequate for their social circle. The clasp released with a soft click. The diamonds felt cold and heavy sliding down my collarbone. I let the expensive necklace drop from my hand. It hit the wooden podium with a sharp, resonant clack. The sound echoed through the microphone, cutting through the remaining whispers in the ballroom. The physical dismissal of their wealth finalized the separation. I set the wireless microphone down gently next to the discarded diamonds. I did not slam it or throw it. I placed it down with the quiet precision of an auditor closing a completed file. I turned my back on Julian, leaving him standing alone on the stage, a broken man in a bespoke tuxedo. I gathered the heavy ivory satin train of my gown, bunching the expensive fabric securely in my fists. I walked down the opposite side of the bandstand, descending the stairs with my head held high. I did not look at table 1. I did not look at Victoria, who was now sobbing quietly into her silk napkin. I did not look at Richard, who was shouting desperately at the backs of his fleeing commercial investors. I walked the entire length of the sprawling Grand Belle ballroom, bisecting the room a second time. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to pass unhindered. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of my dress dragging across the polished hardwood floor. I marched straight toward the darkest corner of the venue, toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The spotlight still illuminated the bare, high-top cocktail table. Thomas and Sarah Hayes stood in the center of the beam, waiting for me. My father's eyes were wide, processing the catastrophic sequence of events he had just witnessed. My mother's hands were trembling, clutching her small canvas evening bag. They had spent 35 years living a quiet, modest life, avoiding the toxic, corrupting influence of the elite circles they secretly owned. Now they were standing at the epicenter of a massive social demolition. I reached the cocktail table. I let the fabric of my dress fall to the floor. I linked my left arm securely through my father's elbow. I reached out and linked my right arm with my mother, holding her trembling hand tightly. "Let us go home," I said, offering them a small, genuine smile. We turned our backs on the wreckage. We walked out of the Grand Belle Hotel together, 3 working-class people, leaving behind a room full of shattered illusions. The crisp evening air of downtown Boise hit my face as we exited the main vestibule. The sound of Richard Sterling shouting frantically echoed faintly behind us, a desperate man trying to salvage a dying empire. The immediate conflict was resolved, but the fallout of the corporate bankruptcy was just beginning to gather momentum. The walk from the Grand Belle Hotel to the parking garage felt like stepping out of a suffocating vacuum and breathing clean Idaho air for the first time in 2 years. I did not look back at the grand facade of the venue. The rhythmic click of my heels echoed alongside the heavy, purposeful strides of my father, navy blue suit trousers. My mother, Sarah, gripped my arm tightly, her canvas evening bag swinging gently against her hip. We did not speak until we reached the quiet concrete level where Thomas had parked his beat-up 2004 Honda Accord. He unlocked the doors with the manual key, the mechanical clunk grounding me instantly in reality. He opened the passenger side for Sarah, waiting until she settled into the worn cloth seat before turning to face me. The fluorescent overhead lights of the garage illuminated the deep lines bracketing his mouth. He looked at the heavy ivory satin gown spilling around my feet, the fabric catching the dirt of the concrete floor. He did not ask if I was okay. He is a man who fixes broken pipes and sweeps gymnasium floors. He understands that some messes require silence before they can be cleaned up. "Anne," he said, his voice thick with a quiet, devastating pride, "I did not know you had that kind of fire in you." I smiled, feeling the first genuine physical release of tension in my shoulders. "I learned it from watching you sweep floors until they shone like glass, Dad. You taught me how to spot the dirt hiding in the corners." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that felt more solid than any country club membership. We climbed into the aging sedan, the heater sputtering to life, blowing warm air only on the driver's side. We drove away from downtown Boise, leaving the wreckage of the Sterling family corporate networking event behind us. I did not cry during the ride home. I felt a profound, icy satisfaction settling into my chest. The forensic audit was complete, and the liability was severed. The collapse of Richard Sterling empire was not a slow, elegant decline. It was swift, brutal, and total. Within 48 hours of the disastrous non-wedding, the investors who attended the reception pulled their funding entirely. The two major commercial developers from Sun Valley, men who despised public humiliation and fraudulent posturing, formally withdrew from all pending joint ventures. They recognized that a CEO who would hide his own landlord by a garbage bin was far too reckless to trust with millions of dollars. The word spread through the exclusive Boise country clubs and private golf courses like a wildfire. Sterling real estate was exposed as functionally bankrupt. Without the critical 10-year ground lease extension from the Hayes Family Trust, Richard Flagship Downtown Plaza was immediately reclassified as a toxic asset. The three regional banks that held his massive, over-leveraged loans triggered emergency margin calls. They demanded immediate liquidity that Richard simply did not possess. He had spent his available cash flow hosting extravagant galas and buying luxury cars to maintain the illusion of dominance. 3 weeks after I walked out of the Grand Bell Ballroom, Sterling Real Estate filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a shocking, sudden downfall of a prominent Boise dynasty. The financial sections detailed the staggering amount of debt the company carried, highlighting the bizarre coincidence that the firm collapsed because they failed to secure a lease renewal from a quiet, blind trust. None of the articles mentioned the wedding. In high society, financial ruin is public record, but the humiliating social execution that triggered the exodus is kept strictly as whispered gossip. My phone became a battleground during those first 3 weeks. Julian blew up my messages with hundreds of frantic, desperate texts. The initial messages alternated wildly between begging for forgiveness and demanding I speak to my father on his behalf. "Anne, please," he wrote at 2 a.m, 3 days after the reception. "I am so sorry. I should have stood up to my dad. I was a coward. I love you. We can still fix this. Please call me." 4 hours later, the tone shifted dramatically. "You destroyed my life, Anne. My dad is losing his mind. The banks are calling the loans. If you just talk to your dad and get the trust to renew the lease, we can save the company. You owe me that much after what you did in front of those people." He was still operating under the delusion that he held some form of leverage. He believed that the 2 years I spent shrinking my personality to fit inside his world meant I still felt a lingering sense of loyalty to his family. He did not understand that the sunk cost fallacy had completely evaporated the moment I saw my parents standing by the catering kitchen doors. I did not reply to a single message. I blocked his number, I blocked his email, and I blocked Victoria on every social media platform I possessed. Victoria was quietly asked to resign from the board of her prestigious country club. The official reason cited was a need for her to focus on personal family matters during a difficult financial transition. The actual reason, which Harper, my best friend and paralegal, gleaned from a senior partner at her law firm, was much more severe. The country club elite did not care that Victoria was suddenly broke. They cared that she was publicly exposed as a fraud. The social system she used to torture my mother, the pastel blue dresses and the subtle insults, had turned against her. Death by 1,000 quiet omissions is the preferred execution method of high society. My father, true to his nature, did not gloat. He did not read the local news articles detailing Richard's downfall. He continued to wake up at 4 a.m. to go to his custodial job at the school district. He maintained his modest routine because material wealth genuinely did not define him. But he did take one very specific, calculated action. He instructed his specialized team of trust attorneys in downtown Boise to finalize the eviction proceedings for the Sterling properties. He directed them to legally reclaim the dirt underneath the massive commercial plaza the moment the original lease expired. One quiet Sunday morning, while we were sitting at his Formica kitchen table drinking coffee, I finally asked him why he did not grant the extension just to avoid the hassle of eviction court. Thomas looked at me, his thick, calloused hands resting on the ceramic mug. His eyes were steady, holding the deep, quiet integrity he had carried for 65 years. A man who treats hard-working people like trash does not deserve to build on my land. Anne, he said, his voice soft but immovable. William left me this dirt to do some good with it. We are going to liquidate that asset next year and use the funds to build a new pediatric wing at St. Luke Hospital. The Sterling family had their turn, and they squandered it on arrogance. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The decision was final, and the justice was absolute. I moved forward with my life, accelerating my career at the financial firm with a renewed sense of ruthless clarity. I secured a promotion, closing complex underwriting portfolios with a precision born from surviving a massive personal fraud. I no longer apologized for my working-class roots. I wore my background like a badge of honor. But the story of the Hayes family trust and the fake wedding had one final, quiet resolution waiting for me. A resolution that did not involve shouting into a microphone or destroying a corporate empire. It involved a completely unexpected envelope arriving at my new downtown condo 8 months later, carrying the one thing I never thought I would receive from the Sterling family. 8 months have passed since that spectacular collision of truth and illusion inside the Grand Bell Hotel. It is a crisp Tuesday evening in late October. I am sitting on the private balcony of my new high-rise condo overlooking downtown Boise. The city lights reflect in shimmering ripples across the dark surface of the Boise River. The crisp autumn wind carries the faint scent of pine needles and distant rain. I hold the standard legal envelope in my hands. The return address belongs to a court-appointed bankruptcy liquidator. Inside the heavy paper rests a certified bank draft for $15,000. It is the exact monetary amount my parents contributed to the floral arrangements and the catering deposit for a wedding that legally never occurred. Attached to the bank draft is a mandatory legal disclosure form detailing the final asset liquidation of Sterling real estate. At the very bottom of the printed page, hiding in the blank margin, there is a handwritten note. It is not drafted by the attorneys. It is penned in the sharp, angular script of Richard Sterling. The ink presses deeply into the paper. You won. We have nothing left. 6 stark words, stripped of all country club pretense and arrogant posturing. The man who mocked my father-frayed navy blue suit in a hotel hallway was now sitting in the ashes of his own hubris, forced to watch his luxury cars and commercial properties auctioned off to satisfy his creditors. I read the short note twice. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. I did not feel the need to celebrate his ruin. I felt a profound, quiet closure settling over my chest. I folded the disclosure document and fed it into the paper shredder, humming quietly beneath my home office desk. I endorsed the bank draft, turning the check over and depositing the funds directly into the pediatric hospital charity account Thomas had recently established. The Sterling family debt to us was settled in full, and their chapter in my life was permanently closed. I poured a warm cup of herbal tea and walked back out to the balcony. My daily reality today is unrecognizable from the suffocating version I tried to build with Julian. I am no longer auditing my own behavior to fit inside an elitist social mold. I earned a major promotion to lead director of the underwriting department at my financial firm. I close massive corporate portfolios with the sharp, unclouded vision of a woman who survived a masterclass in deception. My sanctuary is my home. No one polices my aesthetic choices. No one judges the brand of my shoes or questions the pedigree of my dinner guests. I am surrounded by friends who value character over capital. Harper comes over on weekends, and we drink cheap red wine on the sofa, laughing about the sheer absurdity of high society networking events. But the most beautiful part of this entire aftermath is the steady reality of my parents. Thomas and Sarah Hayes did not change. Exposing their vast hidden wealth to the entire city of Boise could have easily altered their trajectory. But the revelation did not leave a single mark on their daily routine. My father continued to wake up at 4 a.m. to go to his custodial job at the public high school for another 3 months. He still drove his aging Honda Accord with the faulty passenger side heater. When local news reporters tried to camp outside their modest 3-bedroom house in Meridian, seeking an exclusive interview with the secret millionaire landlord Thomas, simply offered the journalists a thermos of hot coffee and politely asked them to step off his grass so he could mow the lawn. He formally retired just a few weeks ago, not because his secret was exposed, but because his bad knees finally demanded rest. He and the trust attorneys liquidated the ground lease formerly held by the Sterlings. They used the massive influx of capital to fund the construction of a brand new pediatric oncology wing at St. Luke Hospital. My mother still works in the floral shop back room a few days a week. She still brings home broken stems and day-old blooms, arranging them in recycled glass jars on her Formica kitchen table. Their authenticity is an impenetrable fortress. They do not need to perform for an audience because they are securely anchored in their own inherent worth. Sometimes colleagues or professional acquaintances who heard the whispered rumors about the Grand Bell Ballroom incident will pull me aside during a networking lunch. They lean in close, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial hush. They ask me if I regret letting the situation escalate into a public spectacle. They ask if I ever feel guilty for dismantling a prominent local dynasty in front of 250 elite guests. My answer is always a swift, unwavering no. I used to believe that keeping the peace meant absorbing disrespect so other people could remain comfortable. I thought shrinking my footprint was the necessary tax I had to pay to be loved by a prominent family. I operated under the delusion that tolerating a toxic environment would eventually earn me a permanent seat at their table. I was wrong. Silence is not a tool for peace. Silence is a form of complicity. When you smile through a microaggression, you give the aggressor permission to escalate their behavior. When you accept a chair near the garbage bins, you teach them that your dignity is a negotiable asset. I learned a vital lesson standing on that elevated bandstand holding the wireless microphone. Boundaries are not brick walls you build out of spite. Boundaries are doors. You control the hinges. You decide who gets to walk through the frame, and you dictate the terms of entry. If someone knocks on your door demanding you hide your roots or mask your heritage, you do not let them inside. You lock the deadbolt. The Sterling family believed they held all the leverage because they possessed country club memberships and tailored Italian wool. They measured human value through a distorted lens of performative wealth. But the loudest individuals in the room are usually hiding the deepest insecurities. Men who possess true power do not need to humiliate high school janitors to feel strong. Women who are secure in their social status do not need to mock pastel blue dresses to validate their own fashion choices. When you finally stop fighting for a seat at a table where you are not respected, you realize you had the power to walk out of the building all along. I am sharing this specific chapter of my life because I know someone out there is currently sitting in their own version of that groomsman suite hallway. You might be listening to a romantic partner, a parent, or a future in-law degrade the people you love. You might be staring at a seating chart that intentionally isolates you from the main event. You might be twisting yourself into psychological knots trying to prove you belong in a room that was structurally designed to exclude you. If you are watching this and someone is making you feel like your origins are a source of shame, I want you to pause and listen very closely. You are not the problem. You are the target of their fragile ego. Do not apologize for the calloused hands that raised you. Do not hide the sacrifices your family made to put you where you are today. Your history is your armor. Wear it with pride. Have you ever reached a breaking point where you had to draw a permanent line with a toxic family member or an elitist partner? Have you ever stood up in a crowded room and refused to be marginalized for one more second? Tell me your story in the comments section below. I read every single submission because I know the immense courage it takes to break the cycle of compliance. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own strength today. Thank you for spending your time with me, and remember, the true measure of your worth is never found in someone else's scorecard. My name is Anne, and I will see you in the next story.